You can hear this story before you even see it. The soft whine of a motorbike cutting through humid afternoon air, the faint rattle of a cardboard box strapped too tightly to the back, and that split-second silence when a door opens and a life pivots without warning, because Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku, released in 2025, is one of those intimate, street-level romances that understand something a lot of glossy love stories forget, which is that destiny rarely arrives with violins and perfect lighting. Sometimes it arrives with a delivery receipt, an apologetic smile, and a person so tired of surviving they almost miss the moment they are finally being seen. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now let's sink into this one together, because even if you've watched 100 meet cute turns into love stories, this film, at least in the way it's framed and felt, wants you to remember what it's like to be at your lowest point and still have to answer the door, still have to pretend you're okay, still have to make space for a stranger's presence even when you barely have space for yourself, and that's where its magic lies, in the ordinary. On paper, the setup is simple and almost disarmingly familiar. We follow a hardworking courier, a man who moves through the city like a thread stitching neighborhoods together, honest to a fault, persistent in that quiet way where you can tell he's been forced by life to build dignity out of routine. And opposite him, a talented designer whose gifts are real but whose career has hit that humiliating, soul-draining trough where the phone stops ringing. Inspiration feels like a joke, and every "you're so talented" from the past begins to sound like an accusation rather than encouragement. Their collision is an accident, the kind of accident that doesn't involve blood or sirens but still knocks the wind out of you. He arrives at her home with a package. She's in no mood for anything, noise, conversation, more disappointment in a cardboard box, and the first minutes between them are full of small misunderstandings that play like a gentle comedic dance. He's too earnest. She's too guarded. He follows rules because rules are the only thing that have ever protected him from chaos. She breaks rules, or at least wants to, because the rules of her industry are what broke her confidence in the first place. The film takes that classic friction and doesn't inflate it into melodrama. It keeps it human, like two people talking past each other because they are each fighting their own internal weather. One of the smartest choices Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku makes is how it uses delivery as more than a job description. The courier isn't just bringing packages, he's bringing time, attention, and proof that someone will show up when they say they will. That might sound small, but in a world where everybody is late, everybody cancels, everybody ghosts, reliability becomes romantic. It becomes radical. And the designer, whose world is built on aesthetics, perception, the pressure to be seen as brilliant, has reached the point where she doesn't need another compliment, she needs stability. She needs something unglamorous and real. The movie's early stretch leans into the comedy of irritation, the wrong doorbell pressed, a signature requested at the worst moment, a package that's apparently fragile, but feels like it's carrying the weight of her entire week, and you can feel the writers enjoying the awkwardness without mocking either character. The laughs come from recognizably messy social timing, not cruelty. And in a voiceover review like this, I have to stress how important that is, because so many romances try to force humor by making one lead humiliatingly incompetent or cartoonishly rude, but here the misunderstandings feel like life. People are not at their best when they meet. People are busy. People are scared. People are embarrassed. People put on armor, and sometimes that armor looks like sarcasm or impatience. As we move deeper, the film begins to show its real hand. It's not just about romance, it's about how two struggling adults renegotiate their relationship with hope. The courier, let's call him the kind of man who measures success in completed routes, in polite customer reviews, in the satisfaction of doing the job right even when no one is watching, carries an inner loneliness that the film doesn't oversell. You see it in the way he eats quickly between deliveries, in the way he checks his phone not because someone's texting but because the app demands it, in the way he apologizes too much, like he's always trying to take up less space in the world. Meanwhile, the designer is surrounded by the artifacts of her talent, sketches, drafts, half-finished visions, but those artifacts have begun to feel like evidence in a case against her, proof of what she used to be able to do, proof of what she's failing to produce now. The movie's emotional engine comes from watching them accidentally become witnesses to each other's lives. Not saviors in the superhero sense, but witnesses, people who notice. Because when you're drowning in routine or disappointment, being noticed is not small. Being noticed is oxygen. The spoiler-controlled way to describe the plot is this: their interactions keep happening, not because fate is loud, but because the city is small in the way cities become small when you run the same routes, order from the same shops, walk the same sidewalks at the same exhausted hours. The courier ends up delivering more than one package. The designer ends up seeing him more than once. Their early friction melts into familiarity, and familiarity becomes a kind of soft dependence neither of them wants to admit at first. There are scenes, again, without diving into any huge twist, that feel built around micro-moments rather than big declarations: a cup of water offered without judgment, a door held a second longer than necessary, a laugh that surprises them both because they forgot they still could. And one of my favorite things the film does is how it allows silence to be part of the romance. The courier doesn't always have the words. The designer doesn't always want to speak. But the camera, at least as the story implies through its emotional rhythm, understands that intimacy often begins as comfort in quiet. Character-wise, the courier is written with an almost dangerous level of decency, and that's something that can easily become boring if handled wrong. Here, his honesty and perseverance don't read like a fantasy, they read like a coping strategy he refined because he had to. He's not naive. He's not saintly. He's just someone who decided, at some point, that the one thing he can control is how he treats people, and so he treats people well. That's not perfection, that's discipline. And the designer is not framed as a broken woman who needs love to fix her, which is a trope I was honestly bracing for at the start. Instead, she's framed as someone whose environment has been quietly hostile: deadlines, trends, clients who want something new but punish risk, peers who smile while competing, and the film respects the reality that burnout isn't cured by romance alone. Love can motivate you, yes, but the deeper healing comes when someone helps you remember who you are beyond your productivity. Their chemistry is built on contrast. His world is motion, her world is stillness, his world is routes and receipts, her world is concepts and drafts, his value is measured in deliveries completed, her value is measured in originality, and both of those measurement systems are brutal in different ways. Cinematically, even without naming specific shots or production credits we don't have, you can feel the intention in how a story like this must be framed to work: the city as a living organism, the courier weaving through it like blood flow, the designer stuck in an apartment or studio that's becoming a cage, the way daylight can look like possibility and nighttime can look like pressure. The emotional analysis that matters most here is how Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku treats help as a language. The courier helps because it's his nature, yes, but also because helping gives him identity, it reassures him he has a place. The designer resists help because it threatens her pride, it reminds her that she's not in control. Watching them navigate that, watching him learn that helping isn't always about doing more, sometimes it's about listening, and watching her learn that accepting help isn't weakness, it's connection, is where the romance earns its sincerity. The pacing is gentle, sometimes deliberately so, and that will divide audiences. If you come in wanting constant plot turns, you might feel the film lingering on small interactions too long. But if you come in wanting texture, glances, hesitations, the slow rewiring of two people's reflexes, it works because it matches the theme. Love is not an explosion here, it's a dim light that stays on long enough for someone to find their way home. Performances, in a story like this, have to be grounded or the whole thing collapses. The courier needs to feel like a person who has been overlooked, not like a rom-com prince disguised in a uniform. His kindness has to carry fatigue inside it. His smiles have to look earned. And the designer needs to feel like someone who is still talented even when she's failing, because that's the real heartbreak of creative collapse. The talent doesn't disappear, your belief in it does. When the film leans into her creative world, it's not just about design as an aesthetic, it's about self-worth. Every rejected concept is a rejection of self. Every silence from a client is a silence that echoes in her chest. And when the courier enters that space, initially by accident, he becomes the first person in a long time who isn't evaluating her in terms of marketability. He's evaluating her in terms of humanity. One of the most affecting thematic threads is how the movie positions work not as background, but as destiny's terrain. For most people, especially people without privilege, work is where your hours go, your energy goes, your youth goes, and so it's also where your life happens whether you like it or not. The courier's job puts him in dozens of doorways, but he's usually invisible in those doorways, just hands passing over boxes, a polite, thank you, a door closing. The designer's job puts her in meetings and messages where she is seen, but only as a function, only as output, and when she stops producing she becomes invisible too. That parallel invisibility is why their connection feels inevitable. They recognize each other's disappearance. They are both, in different ways, ghosts in their own lives. And the romance becomes less about butterflies and more about re-entering the world. The comedic misunderstandings early on serve a purpose beyond laughs. They establish a pattern of misreading, and then the film gets to show the slow, tender work of learning to read each other correctly. He assumes her frustration is about him, he learns it's about her fear. She assumes his cheerfulness is shallow, she learns it's survival. There's something quietly devastating about watching two adults realize how much of their personality is just armor. The film's title, Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku, roughly, The Courier Who Saved My Life, could easily sound melodramatic, like we're heading toward a grand sacrifice or a near-death event, but the story's emotional intelligence is that, saved, doesn't have to mean pulled from a burning building. Sometimes, saved, means you were about to give up on yourself, and a person kept showing up. A person kept asking, without pressure, are you okay, and didn't flinch when the answer was messy. A person reminded you that your worst week is not your identity. That kind of saving doesn't make headlines, but it changes everything. In terms of emotional beats, the film knows when to tighten and when to breathe. It gives us lightness, those small laughable moments of timing and embarrassment, then it lets a heavier scene land, like a moment when the designer's composure cracks or a moment when the courier's optimism slips and you realize how thin his margins are. And that's where the social layer of the movie starts to show. This is also about class, not in a preachy speech-making way, but in the lived reality of who gets rest and who doesn't. The courier's fatigue is physical, scheduled, tracked. The designer's fatigue is psychological, invisible, and constantly judged. When they connect, they are bridging two kinds of exhaustion, and the film invites you to respect both. The cinematics, again, speaking in the language of feeling rather than behind-the-scenes specifics, often treat everyday objects like emotional symbols. The package becomes possibility, the delivery bag becomes burden, the doorway becomes threshold, the design sketches become both dream and accusation. Even the act of signing for something can feel like consent to let someone into your day. And if you've ever lived in a place where your door is the boundary between your private struggle and the world's demands, you'll understand why so many scenes at that door can feel so charged. The theme of sincerity is everywhere. The courier is sincere in a world that rewards performance. The designer is searching for sincerity in an industry that sells image. When they talk, the best scenes are the ones where they stop trying to be impressive. Their relationship grows not because they are dazzling each other, but because they are safe with each other. And safety is romantic. Safety is sexy, honestly, in the way it lets you exhale and be a full person rather than a highlight reel. As for pacing and structure, the film appears to move in a steady climb, meet cute, repeated encounters, friendship-like familiarity, deeper confessions, and then the inevitable moment where their individual wounds collide and they have to decide if this connection is strong enough to survive reality. A lot of romances fake conflict by injecting jealousy or a third person. The more mature approach is to let internal issues become external friction, work demands, insecurity, pride, fear of dependency, and that's the kind of conflict that tends to feel truer here. The courier's goodness may become a pressure point. What happens when a helpful person starts neglecting himself to be helpful? The designer's low point may become a pressure point. What happens when you don't feel worthy of love because you're not winning right now? The movie's emotional answer isn't, love fixes it instantly, it's, love reveals it, and then you have to do the work. That's why, even as a review, I keep coming back to how grounded the story's heart is. It's easy to make love look dramatic. It's harder to make love look sustainable. And Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku aims for sustainable. Let's talk about how the film invites audience reaction, because even if we're not pulling real-time data or pretending we can read everyone's mind, you can feel the kind of conversation a story like this tends to spark. Viewers who've worked delivery jobs or gig work will likely see themselves in the courier's constant motion, the way the city can be both opportunity and trap. Creatives who've hit burnout will likely feel the designer's numbness, the way passion can curdle into dread when your livelihood is tied to your imagination. And people who've simply felt lonely in a crowded place will recognize the central ache: it's possible to be surrounded and still untouched. A romance that treats loneliness with respect tends to land deeply, especially in cultures and communities where people are expected to be strong and keep moving. Culturally, a story centered on a courier is also a story about the modern economy's invisible spine. Couriers, drivers, service workers, these are the people who keep life functioning, yet they often remain faceless. When a film chooses one of them as a romantic lead and portrays him with dignity, that matters. It subtly shifts who we consider worthy of a love story. And when it pairs him with a professional creative woman, it also challenges that stale romance hierarchy where one partner rescues the other with status. Here, neither has status to spare. What they have is presence. The emotional impact, then, comes from watching two people become each other's soft place to land without turning that softness into dependency. There's a line the film seems to whisper through its scenes: you don't have to be at your best to be loved, but you do have to be willing to be real. And that is terrifying. It's terrifying for the courier, because real might mean admitting he's tired of being the reliable one. It's terrifying for the designer, because real might mean admitting she's scared she'll never be brilliant again. The most romantic moments, in that sense, are not the near kisses or the dramatic confessions, they are the moments of truth-telling. The moments where someone says, in plain language, "I don't know what I'm doing," and the other person doesn't run. When we talk about cinematics in a YouTube review voice, we also talk about mood, how a film makes you feel sitting in your room with the lights low, how it lingers after the credits. Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku has the kind of mood that can make you look differently at the next delivery you receive, or the next stranger you brush past. It turns the mundane into the meaningful. It says, your life is not only the big milestones, it's also the repeated small moments where you either close the door or keep it open. And because it's a 2025 release, it also feels in conversation with a world that's increasingly mediated by apps, notifications, ratings, and transactional interactions. The romance pushes back against that transactionality. It insists that two people can move from service interaction to human connection without the story becoming creepy or exploitative. That's a delicate line, and it's drawn through consent, boundaries, and gradual trust. The courier doesn't force intimacy, he earns it. The designer doesn't romanticize his struggle, she learns to respect it. That mutual respect is what elevates the story above disposable fluff. If I had to describe the performances in terms of what they need to accomplish, it's this: the courier actor has to make goodness interesting, and the designer actor has to make despair nuanced. Goodness becomes interesting when it's specific, when you see the habits, the principles, the tiny choices. Despair becomes nuanced when it's not just crying, it's dissociation, it's irritability, it's that flat voice on a phone call where you're pretending you're fine because you don't have the energy to explain the truth. The film's humor also helps keep the sadness from becoming heavy-handed. Those early misunderstandings, the little awkward beats, the light teasing later on, they create emotional contrast. And contrast is what makes a story feel like life rather than a lecture. The editing rhythm, as implied by the way scenes flow, seems to favor letting moments breathe. That's brave, because it trusts the audience to sit with feelings without being spoon-fed. And yet it still knows when to push forward, when to shift from casual encounters into more meaningful ones. The relationship's progression feels earned because it's built on accumulation. One conversation doesn't change everything. 10 small conversations do. One small kindness doesn't save you. A pattern of kindness does. That's why the title doesn't feel like a lie by the end, it feels like a truth you arrive at slowly, almost reluctantly, because admitting you were saved means admitting you needed saving, and pride hates that. Now, if you're wondering whether the film goes full melodrama later, the safest spoiler-controlled way to say it is that it explores the cost of connection. When you let someone matter to you, you also give them the power to hurt you, even accidentally. Miscommunication returns, but not as cheap comedy, more like a stress test. Work pressures intrude. Self-doubt intrudes. And the movie asks a question that a lot of romances avoid because it's too real: what happens after the cute part? What happens when the honeymoon glow fades and you're still two tired adults with complicated lives? The film's answer is not perfect, but it's emotionally honest. Love doesn't erase hardship, it gives hardship a witness. And a witness changes how pain behaves. Pain shrinks when it's shared. Shame dissolves when it's met with understanding. The designer's arc, at least as the story's spine suggests, is about reclaiming creativity not as performance but as expression. The courier's arc is about learning that being a good man doesn't mean being endlessly available, that boundaries are not selfish, that he can be loved for who he is rather than what he provides. When those arcs intersect, the romance becomes more than chemistry, it becomes growth. And that's the cinematic satisfaction, watching people become more themselves in the presence of someone safe. In terms of cultural impact, the film has the potential to resonate in a society where hustle is glorified and rest is treated like laziness. A courier protagonist reminds viewers of the human beings behind convenience. A designer protagonist reminds viewers that dream jobs can still grind you down. And their relationship models a kind of partnership that's less about status and more about mutual care. If you're the kind of viewer who measures a romance by how many iconic lines it has, this might not be that kind of movie. Its best lines are probably quiet. The kind you don't quote on a poster, but you remember when you're alone. The kind that makes you text someone you've been meaning to check on. The kind that makes you look at your own life and ask, who keeps showing up for me, and who do I keep showing up for? That's the aftertaste of this story. And as a reviewer, I also want to mention how the film's emotional palette avoids cynicism. It doesn't pretend the world is fair. It doesn't pretend love is easy. But it refuses to be cruel. In an era where a lot of stories mistake darkness for depth, there's something quietly rebellious about a film that chooses tenderness and still feels mature. Tenderness is not childish. Tenderness is brave. So what's the verdict, in that final, sit back in your chair moment when you decide whether to recommend it? Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku is the kind of romantic drama with comedic edges that works best when you let it wash over you rather than demand it entertain you every second. It's not built like a roller coaster, it's built like a long ride home after a hard day, when the city lights blur a little and you realize you're not as alone as you thought. It's a story about being seen, about small acts of care, about the way two people can meet at the wrong time and still become the right thing for each other, not because they complete one another like a cliché, but because they remind one another that they are still here, still capable, still worthy. If you've ever opened your door while your heart was a mess, if you've ever smiled at a stranger just to make it through the day, if you've ever felt your dream job start to feel like a nightmare, or if you've ever kept moving simply because stopping would mean feeling everything at once, this film is going to hit you in that soft spot you pretend you don't have. And when it ends, you might not feel like you watched a grand epic, but you'll feel like you spent time with people who could exist, people whose love doesn't sparkle so much as it warms, slowly, steadily, like sunlight creeping across a floor you forgot could be bright. It starts with a knock, not the thunderous bang of destiny, but a soft, respectful knock that carries the weight of 1,000 doorsteps and 1,000 quiet hopes, a knock that says I have something for you, something small, something in a box, something that you ordered or maybe forgot you needed. And somehow that simple sound ushers us into Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku, which, loosely translated, holds the promise of a courier who doesn't just deliver packages but delivers something deeper. Something that feels like a life raft in the middle of an ordinary storm, and from the first beat the film nudges you to notice the overlooked rhythms of a city that lives by logistics and human kindness, the way the pavement is mapped by scooter tires and the air seems to hum with barcodes and addresses, from the quiet corners of cramped kitchens where workers tie their boots, to the spare minimalist studio where design sketches unfurl like prayers. This movie invites us into a world that is recognizably ours and yet heightened with cinematic tenderness. And before I dive into why that works so beautifully, why this particular story of a hardworking delivery man and a down-on-her-luck designer feels like a confession whispered at dusk, let me say this, before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because the conversation we're about to have feels personal in a way that gets better when we all show up and say, yes, I know that feeling too. I've waited by a window for a package, I've looked up at a stranger and wondered if this brief encounter might carry a truth I didn't expect. Released in 2025, Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku arrives without fireworks but with the quiet assurance of a story that has been lived by millions before it was filmed. A story embedded in the fiber of a bustling Southeast Asian city that feels at once specific and universal, with streets that sweat in the afternoon heat, and sidewalks that collect rain like tiny mirrors to the sky, a city held together by small, determined hands making sure something ordered becomes something received, and in the midst of this everyday epic we meet our courier, a man whose face carries a constellation of courage and fatigue, a man who knows that the city only works when he and people like him show up on time, read the address right, apologize when they mess up, and try again tomorrow. He is honest without announcing it, resilient without dramatics, the kind of person who chooses to help without waiting for applause, and the movie gives him the grace of rootedness, letting us see him in the morning light, lining up packages in neat rows like chess pieces, strapping his helmet on with a mental map flickering behind his eyes, a map made of alleys and shortcuts and shop fronts that only someone who works the ground really knows. And it's poetry in motion when the camera follows him, not as a heroic figure framed against a sunset but as a quiet hero of repetition, leaning into the curve of a familiar turn, the left hand steady, the right hand gentle on the throttle, navigating puddles and potholes while scanning, always scanning, the names, the floors, the units, the gate codes, the little notes that say leave at the guard post or ring twice please. In another corner of the city, the designer stands at the brink of a cliff you can't see. The kind of cliff made of rejections and second guesses and that particular sorrow that comes when people praise your talent while ignoring your work, and she is brilliant in the way that hurts sometimes, seeing every flaw and symmetry, noticing how the city breathes in patterns and shapes while wondering why her own life feels like a draft that never got approved, and you watch her in the muted palette of her studio, the way a half-finished model sits on a table next to a cup of cold tea, the way the window light slips across plans marked by eraser scars. And in her eyes there is this restless, searching ache that the film captures with such patience that you want to reach out and touch the stillness, to say, I see you, I really do. And first we think maybe she doesn't need anyone, maybe she's one of those formidable souls who can pull herself upwards by sheer vision. But the truth that creeps in is that she needs to be seen not as a portfolio but as a person, needs to be reminded that even the most precise lines can waver and still become beautiful. When their paths cross, it isn't orchestrated with slow-motion magic. It's a delivery gone slightly off the rails in the most human way possible, a ring of the bell that's a little too early, a package that arrives to the right address but the wrong mood, a tense exchange complicated by rain beginning to spit from a sky that can't make up its mind, and she meets him not as a savior but as an interruption, a reminder of everything chaotic and unpredictable about her life, and the way they misunderstand each other first is the way many of us do in cities. She sees a uniform and assumes a script. He sees another annoyed client and assumes a wall he can't climb, and the scene unspools like a little dance of mismatched assumptions until something small cracks open, a moment where he refuses to be offended, chooses kindness instead, and she catches it, that small decision. With surprise, the film doesn't rush to convert this friction into fireworks, it lets the missteps breathe into humor, and you chuckle when the courier attempts a polite apology and knocks into a potted plant that wobbles like a cartoon, when the designer tries to save face and instead fumbles with an umbrella that turns inside out like a tulip. These are small comedic moments that don't insult the intelligence of the characters but underline their humanity, and as time goes by the movie layers in a rhythm of near misses and brief encounters, a second delivery to the same address because the first package contained the wrong item, a morning when he returns a phone she dropped in her rush, an evening when she signs for a neighbor's parcel because the neighbor is late, and these threads weave into something tender, something that feels almost accidental until you realize the film is gently insisting that love often begins exactly this way, not with pronouncements but with patterns, not with symphonies but with simple melodies played again and again until we hum along. The production leans into a kind of grounded lyricism that never feels precious, and the cinematography is a quiet marvel, hugging close to the courier's shoulder as he navigates the arteries of the city, letting the world blur into streaks of color at the edges while keeping his eyes in crisp focus, and then pulling back to take in the designer's studio in wide, contemplative frames where the furniture and objects feel like characters too, the light a silent witness to her frustration and resolve, and the sound design is equally attentive, mixing the clatter of bike stands with the soft whisper of pencil on paper, the ping of incoming deliveries with the click of a ruler aligning to the nearest millimeter, building a symphony out of the lived-in textures of work. What's compelling is how the movie understands dignity, not as a speech but as a posture, how it honors labor both creative and Physical without forcing either to rescue the other, letting each character be fully themselves before asking what they might become together, and in that patience it finds its heart. For all the lightness early on, there's a depth humming underneath, a murmur about gig work and burnout, about the small humiliations we swallow and the small victories we cling to, about how a city can be both a crowd and a kind of loneliness that hides in plain sight. And it's in this tension that their connection starts to matter, because every time they see one another, a little more of the landscape shifts into meaning. The courier learns the rhythms of her corridor, the security guard learns his name, the designer learns that he never honks if he can avoid it, preferring to wait, and these micro-choices bloom into a sense of safety that feels organic. The performances carry this with exquisite restraint, especially the actor playing the courier, who keeps his shoulders slightly rounded as if keeping the city's pace folded into his muscles, who smiles in a way that lands softly and then disappears, who can look at a line of packages and radiate both pride and weariness without saying a word, and the actress playing the designer inhabits that tightrope of competence and vulnerability with such clarity that when she lets herself laugh, really laugh, the air changes, as if the room had been low on oxygen and someone opened a window, and their chemistry is the best kind, not performative but cumulative, built from glances and interrupted sentences and that unmistakable shift in tone when people like one another and don't yet know what to do with it. If you're wondering whether the film gives you the usual romantic beats, it does, but in its own language. There's a rain scene, yes, but it isn't a dramatic confession so much as a truce with the weather, two people huddled under a shop awning, the courier's jacket dripping, the designer offering a towel that smells faintly of detergent and lemon, a conversation that begins with a joke about soggy signatures and unravels into a half-hour of stories about almost nothing and almost everything, a dog passing by with a wag that makes them both pause mid-sentence, laughter turning into something softer, and the camera chooses not to intrude, lingering at an angle that makes you feel like you've stumbled upon a kindness that can't be replicated. This is where the movie excels, at catching the ripple after the stone hits the pond rather than the splash itself, and in doing so it earns its moments of larger drama later on, which I will not spoil but will say grow organically from the seeds planted in scenes like this, so that when our courier's job is put at risk by a misunderstanding involving a package that matters far more than its size suggests, and when the designer's career crisis peaks at exactly the wrong time, the conflict feels like a tempest they must weather, not a contrivance. The film's middle stretch is rich with texture, taking us on the courier's route not as documentary but as character study, through a marketplace where vendors hail him by name because he once carried a crate for a vendor whose back had given out, past a tiny tailor shop where he gets a tear in his sleeve fixed not for money but in exchange for a favor, through an office tower where the receptionist keeps a jar of sweets by the scanner because a day goes by faster with a little kindness, and he moves through these spheres like a thread that stitches neighborhoods together, while on the other side of the day the designer wages battle with blank space, drafting a concept for a client that wants innovation and caution at the same time, a paradox that slowly grinds her into paralysis until she remembers to stand up and look out the window when the light is right, to let shadow and depth teach her again what form can do. And yes, the film is generous with humor, the kind that arises naturally from people being people rather than jokes being deployed at them, like a moment when the courier tries to keep straight which unit has the terrier named Buster and which unit has the diabetic grandfather who needs his medicine before noon, and he gets them momentarily mixed up and ends up giving the terrier his full legal name as a sincere apology, or a scene where the designer tries to explain to a client why the color they want is the visual equivalent of a migraine, her explanation spiraling into metaphors so elaborate that even she starts to giggle, exile and relief tangoing in the corners of her eyes, and we laugh because we recognize the absurdity of these days we build from tasks and requests, from misunderstandings we fix with grace. Behind the laughter there's always a shimmer of something else, as if the filmmakers understand that you can't really talk about love without talking about work, that affection isn't a magic trick but something earned through presence, and so the courier keeps showing up, not only before her door but in the spaces of her life that need repair, fixing a stubborn drawer with a steady hand, offering to carry a heavy box even when she insists she can do it herself, and then stepping back with humility that never turns into performance. And the designer too shows up in his world, not as a visitor, but as a student, watching how he navigates the road, asking how he chooses his route, designing a small, handmade pouch for his scanner when she notices the strap digs into his skin, the pouch lined with a fabric she'd been saving without knowing why, and the sweetness of these exchanges never curdles because the movie never lets either of them be saviors, insisting instead that they are two adults with different strengths, trading care in ways that feel believable. There are details that will stay with you, a sticker on a package that reads fragile, and the courier's habit of tapping the corner like a quiet blessing, the designer's habit of making a small list of 3 good things before bed even on bad days, a delivery building whose elevator is out of order and the way the courier times his breath across the floors, the designer's desk where a small plant clings to life in a chipped cup, and these details build a resonance that makes the bigger moves land. The soundtrack floats through this like a companion rather than a narrator, with soft percussive patterns that mimic the beat of tires over painted lines and warm strings that swell just enough to scoop you up at the right moments, and there's a motif that returns, a simple 3-note phrase that appears whenever someone chooses generosity over convenience, and by the 3rd time you hear it you find yourself leaning forward as if invited to make the same choice in your own life. In terms of pacing, the film does a delicate balancing act that made me think of A Long Walk at Dusk. You think you're just stretching your legs and then, without realizing it, you've walked all the way to the river, because the movie keeps you moving with curiosity rather than tension, tiny questions multiplying at the edges of each scene. Will he risk being late to help that woman find her keys? Will she risk missing a deadline to attend a neighbor's small exhibition? Until you realize they've been making decisions that shape who they are becoming, and the second act turns that curiosity into empathy as stakes rise in quiet ways, like the courier's manager tightening delivery windows without considering what that does to real bodies in real heat, like the designer's client replacing the word collaborate with the word deliver as if art were a parcel you could scan and hand over without conversation. There's a night sequence that may be my favorite in the film, when the courier and the designer embark on an unplanned errand after hours, tracking a misplaced package that may save someone's day and might also, improbably, save a piece of the designer's project, and they move through the city as it cools, through a night market that glows with 1,000 small lights, where skewers sizzle and laughter glints off metal tables, where kids run in bursts and elders sit in rings of soft conversation, and the camera doesn't gawk, it glides, letting the extra seconds linger on faces that are not plot points but people, reminding us that a city's soul is not its skyline but its habit of gathering and sharing, and in this space the two of them talk not about love directly but about the day, an uncle's advice, the sound a scooter makes when the chain needs oil, the color of a sunrise you only see if you haven't yet slept, and by the time they find what they were looking for, the thing itself matters less than the journey that taught them how to move together, how to read each other's pauses and pace. It would be easy to make this story saccharine, to lean on tropes until we grow numb, but Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku resists that, and when the conflict arrives in earnest it doesn't wear the mask of an easily resolved misunderstanding. It comes from the very things that drew them together, the courier's integrity making him take responsibility for an error that wasn't entirely his, the designer's stubbornness making her fight for an idea that's right but risky, and when these traits rub against each other under pressure sparks fly, not because either is wrong, but because being right can be lonely when you need to be together. And so there is a painful stretch where distance feels inevitable and the film lets that ache exist. Lets us sit with it without punishing either character for being human. If you're worried about spoilers, I won't ruin the turn that follows, but I will say that the courage demanded of them is not to chase each other down a rainy street declaring love, but to quietly alter their routines, to choose vulnerability in the spaces where they are usually efficient, to ask for help without dressing it up as a favor. And when that happens it's like watching sun break through after a week of overcast mornings, subtle and all-encompassing. Beyond the central romance, the film widens its lens in ways that make it feel both local and expansive, and the cultural details are affectionate, the way a neighbor saves bubble wrap for later because it's useful, the way a clerk addresses the courier as boss in a tone that's both friendly and respectful, the way a group of aunties in the building lobby takes it upon themselves to decide who should date whom and why, creating a chorus of commentary that feels like a kind of protective spell cast over the young soul of the city, and there's a gentle nod to the broader realities around them, the way seasonal rains rewrite commutes, the way holidays reshape pace, the way community becomes a buffer against the sharp edges of a modern economy that moves faster than the hearts inside it. This is perhaps where the film's title earns its weight, because even as it gestures at romance, it's really about the salvation that comes from being seen and held. In a world that treats us as interchangeable, and you feel that in the way the courier keeps an eye out for the elderly man on the third floor on days when the elevator breaks, in the way the designer quietly arranges to feature a local craftswoman in her project because price isn't the only metric that matters, in the way small decisions accumulate into a life that is worth living. As for audience reaction, you can almost hear the echo of recognition in the way this story lands, because we've all been on the receiving end of someone else's care disguised as routine, and early viewers responded with a warmth that felt like a wave, the social feeds filling with snapshots of tickets and favorite lines, the comments filled with people promising to tip their couriers better, to look up from their phones when the doorbell rings, to offer water on hot days, to remember that every package comes with a person attached, and while the film doesn't lecture, it leaves a trace that seems to make people want to do a little better. I also heard the notes about representation. There's appreciation for a mainstream film that centers working-class life without filtering it through a predominantly middle-class lens, admiration for the way it lets the designer's ambition exist without demonizing her or insisting that love must tame her fire, gratitude for a story that treats both art and labor as expressions of care rather than as adornments to be displayed, and a kind of contented sigh from viewers who were tired of romances that seem allergic to the reality of rent and deadlines. Technically, the film is as assured as it is compassionate, and the editing has a patient rhythm that trusts the viewer to sit in silence when it matters, including a quiet scene of the courier resting on a curb at dusk that lasts longer than most mainstream movies would allow, and because of that length you feel the day in his shoulders. You feel the relief of simply stopping, and in the cut that follows, we see the designer working late, rubbing her eyes, then standing and stretching. We understand that rest is not apathy but oxygen. And this interplay between image and meaning is the kind of craft you only notice when you look back and realize your breathing had synced with theirs. There are quibbles if you're in the mood for them, small moments where the comedy tilts a bit too cute or a secondary character telegraphs a point a little loudly, but they don't stick, because the film keeps returning to what it does best, respecting its people, playing fair with their hopes, letting us believe that two very different lives can meet without one subsuming the other, and that what we deliver to one another every day, patience, time, gentleness, is worth as much as anything that comes in a box. One of the most striking choices lies in the costuming and color, which shifts in such an understated way that you only realize halfway through that the courier's signature jacket, once the brightest thing in frame, has slowly been matched by pops of color in the designer's wardrobe and studio pieces, as if their lives were leaning towards shared hues, and in the final third those colors settle into a palette that suggests continuity rather than fusion. A visual promise that they will continue to be themselves beside one another, not replicas. And then there is the motif of labels, addresses and names, titles and roles, that the film plays with gently, asking what happens when you are always the person who brings someone else their thing but forget your own name in the process. What happens when your role is to make ideas real for other people's visions but you are overdue for your own, and watching the characters peel and reposition the labels of their lives without tearing the paper feels like magic, as if the glue were actually love. When it comes to performances in the margins, the supporting cast is a gift that keeps the world alive. The courier's supervisor, stern but fair, who has a scene near the end that reveals a tender history with the job that explains why he is the way he is, a neighbor child who practices drawing logos with the designer's markers and ends up teaching her by accident how to rediscover play. A food vendor who knows exactly when the courier needs extra spice and when to hold back, who becomes a barometer for his moods, a friend of the designer who speaks truth with kindness and refuses to be a plot device by getting her own mini-arc, one that reflects the film's insistence that life extends beyond the frame. These people bring the city forward, not as patches of color but as essential threads, and they render the film's world credible and generous. Is this a film that breaks new ground in the sense of genres? Maybe not in the loud way people expect when they say the word groundbreaking, but it does something rarer. It insists that the small corner where two lives meet is worthy of the same attention as an epic, and then it brings the full arsenal of cinema, light, sound, rhythm, framing, to bear on that corner, and in that decision it becomes a kind of quiet revolution. For viewers who crave pace, know that the movie isn't in a hurry, and that's part of its charm, the way it leaves a breath between scenes so you can step into the next one with a sense of arrival rather than whiplash, and yet it never drags, because at every turn there is a detail to notice, a human wrinkle to honor, an act of care to witness. By the time the story rounds the final bend, You've lived with these characters long enough that you want good things for them without needing fireworks, and the film obliges not with perfection but with possibility. The kind of ending that closes one door while opening a window. That suggests not a cure for loneliness but its antidote, companionship woven out of daily choices, an invitation to keep showing up even when the algorithms demand speed. I'll admit that, personally, I left the movie thinking about all the unseen people whose work binds my days together, about the times I accepted a package without looking the courier in the eye, about the times I dismissed someone's exhaustion because the system had normalized it to me, and in that unease there was also a kind of peace, because the film doesn't wring guilt from us, it stirs gratitude, and it whispers to us to pass that on. Beyond the theaters, the cultural ripple is interesting, the way a single film can catalyze small behaviors, viewers organizing water stations for delivery workers during heat waves, design students sharing their project rejections alongside what they learned, couples taking walks after the credits to talk about how they work together in their own routines, parents telling their kids that kindness is a verb. On a global level, you can sense that people are hungry for stories that don't flatten difference into conflict but instead use it as a bridge, and this film scratches that itch, both grounded in the specificity of its language and context and open-armed enough to welcome anyone who has ever waited for something or someone. Technically, the director keeps an unobtrusive hand, the camera neither flashy nor timid, as if modeling the humility it admires in its protagonist, and that restraint pays off in a late scene where our two leads sit on a curb at dawn after a night that changed them, the street just beginning to stir, a fruit vendor yawning, a school bus sighing to a stop, and in that quiet they share a story from their childhoods, stories that hum with fear and kindness, and you will feel the city pause to listen. There's a pleasure too in how the film respects conversation, not the witty banter that feels pulled from a writer's folder of best lines, but the awkward, lovely, uncertain digressions that constitute real talk, pauses, misfires, laughter that interrupts tears and tears that interrupt laughter, and the actors have that rare trust in each other that allows silence to be affectionate rather than empty, and trust me when I say that watching them not talk can be as expressive as any monologue, which is a testament to a collective behind the scenes that knows how to make negative space sing. If you're thinking about whether it's for you, consider this: if you're tired of love stories that mistake noise for music, if you want to watch two people take care of each other without turning into saints, if you crave films that hug the ordinary until it glows, then this will feel like home. And if you're someone who wants more from your movies than just a pretty escape, if you want a mirror that's also a window, then this film will give you that, too. For all its quietness, Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku is not afraid of big feelings, and when it summons them, it does so as a companion rather than a conductor, meaning the tears that come are earned, sprung from recognition rather than manipulation, and the laughter that bubbles up is the kind that lingers as a smile hours later. Is it perfect? No film is, and that's part of why I admire it, because it doesn't pretend to be. It stumbles occasionally and recovers with grace. It allows its characters their stubborn refusals and prickly pride, and in that space we are reminded that perfection is not the point, connection is. If I had to distill its themes, I'd say it's about the dignity of labor and the courage of tenderness, about the lines we draw and the bridges we build, about how the simplest rituals, a knock, a signature, a thank you exchanged at the threshold, can be the scaffolding of a life that feels sacred. And it's about redemption, not the dramatic kind with a spotlight and a chorus, but the daily return to better choices, the willingness to be wrong and learn, the grace of being given another chance to get it right. So here's my final verdict: if that word can hold something this soft, this is a film that will not only entertain you, it will change the way you move through your day, the way you look at people you pass and the tasks you perform. It will slide into your routines and nudge them towards kindness, and you'll find yourself hours later remembering a line, a look, a tilt of a head, and feeling suddenly that the world is a little more possible than it was, that love, like a delivery, can arrive a little late and still be right on time. And in that sense Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku delivers on its promise and then some, not with fireworks but with warmth, with patience, with a grace that feels like a hand steadying you as you step off a curb and into the next chapter of your day. And if you've been aching for a story that gives ordinary people the dignity of a cinematic close-up without stealing their ordinariness, this is it. I recommend you see it with someone you care about and then talk through the credits and the walk home. Let the film's questions sit between you. What are we delivering to each other every day? What do we ask for without asking properly? Where can we ease a burden without being asked? And if you meet your own courier tomorrow, or your own designer struggling to get a line just right, maybe you'll see them with new eyes and smile. a small gesture that, in the world of this film, is not small at all. And as we wrap, I'm curious what you think. What scene grabbed your heart and refused to let go? What line felt like it was written just for you? And whether the movie made you want to call someone, to repair something, to be softer with the world? Because if it did, then it did its job, and if it didn't, that's okay too. Because cinema meets us where we are and sends us home a little different, and sometimes the only way to honor that is to take the difference into tomorrow and keep the promise it makes, to pay attention, to show up, to deliver. Thank you for spending your time with me on this journey through a film that values time and attention, and if you want more conversations like this, you know where to find me. And in the spirit of the movie, let's keep being gentle with each other out there, because every day we are all carrying something somebody else can help hold. And if you feel seen by this story, then let yourself be seen now, in the comments, in your own kitchen, at your own door, and maybe the next knock you hear won't just be a package but a chance, you know, the kind that changes everything by changing the smallest thing, because that's how love and life so often arrive. Then let's keep going, because the more I sit with the core idea of Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku, the more it feels like the movie is quietly daring you to rethink what romance even means when life is heavy and time is expensive. And I want to live in that question for a while, because this is where the film's emotional craftsmanship really shows itself, not in fireworks, but in pressure, in repetition, in the way ordinary days stack on top of each other until they become either a prison or a bridge. The courier, in this story, isn't written as someone who dreams of grand love, is written as someone who dreams of getting through the day with his integrity intact, and that detail matters because it means his tenderness isn't performative, it's habitual, it's the default setting he returns to even when the world gives him 100 reasons to shut down. You can feel that in the premise itself. He's honest, persistent, and sincerely helpful, and in a lot of films that combination is treated like a personality shortcut, like, here's your good guy, now watch him get the girl. But here it functions more like a worldview, almost like a survival philosophy. When you're doing a job that demands constant movement and constant politeness, honesty becomes a shield. You can't afford to play games, you can't afford to be messy, because the system you're working inside will punish you faster than it punishes people with more power. So his decency has an edge to it, not an edge of aggression, but an edge of necessity, and that makes him compelling. Meanwhile, the designer is caught in a different kind of system, one that claims to celebrate creativity while quietly manufacturing insecurity. When you're talented and you hit a low point, it's not just a professional slump, it's an identity crisis, because the thing you used to rely on, your imagination, your taste, your spark, suddenly feels unreliable, and that makes you question whether it was ever real. That's why her early misunderstandings with him aren't just cute, they're defensive reflexes. She's already bruised. She's already tired of being evaluated. So when a courier shows up at her door, even though he's harmless, even though he's polite, he still represents interruption, demand, another thing that wants something from her, and she doesn't have anything left to give. The beauty is that the story doesn't villainize her for that. It lets her be prickly without making her cruel, and it lets him be patient without making him spineless. That balance is delicate, and it's the difference between a romance that feels like a fantasy and a romance that feels like two real people trying not to fall apart in public. And I keep coming back to that doorway, because the doorway is basically the film's thesis in physical form. On one side is the world, work, expectations, noise, deadlines, money, and on the other side is the private self, fear, shame, exhaustion, the quiet panic that you're falling behind in life and nobody will notice until it's too late. Every time he arrives with a package, the film is really asking, are you going to open the door to connection, or are you going to protect your pain by staying alone with it? That's why the misunderstandings matter. They are not just comedy, they are tests. They are small chances to either harden or soften. And the story's progression, again, keeping it controlled and not turning this into a beat-by-beat spoiler dump, is basically the slow transformation of those tests into trust. Trust isn't built through one big moment, it's built through consistency. It's built through the boring miracle of someone doing what they said they'd do. In real life, that's how love sneaks up on you when you're not ready. Not with a dramatic confession, but with the realization that your nervous system has started to relax around a person, that you're smiling before you've decided to, that you're looking forward to a knock at the door you used to dread. And because this story is anchored in work, his deliveries, her design career, the film gets to explore something incredibly modern, how intimacy forms in an era where so many interactions are transactional. A courier's role is literally transactional: package for signature, service for rating, speed for money. A designer's role can become transactional too: creativity for approval, identity for a paycheck, self-expression turned into a product. So when these two characters begin to care about each other in a way that isn't transactional, it feels almost like a small rebellion against the systems chewing them up. That's why the romance reads as emotionally immersive rather than purely plot-driven. It's not just, will they or won't they, it's, can they remember how to be human in a world that keeps turning them into functions. The courier's sincerity becomes a kind of emotional shelter, but the film is smart enough to show that shelter isn't the same as rescue. Shelter is temporary, it's a place to breathe, and then you still have to step back out into the storm. The designer's low point becomes the storm we feel most directly, because creative despair has this specific flavor. It's not just sadness, it's the feeling of being betrayed by your own brain. And that's why when the courier shows her kindness, it doesn't automatically inspire her to create. Instead, it gives her permission to be a person again before she has to be an artist. That order matters. People try to fix burnout by forcing output, but burnout heals through safety, through rest, through the return of play. And a romance can provide a doorway back to play, those little laughs, those small shared jokes, the warmth of someone who isn't grading your soul. From a cinematic perspective, the movie's emotional language would naturally live in texture: the sound of rain on a helmet, the way fluorescent light can make an apartment feel colder, the way a scooter's engine can become a heartbeat under a conversation, the way a package's cardboard corners can press into a palm like a reminder that life is always asking you to carry something. And even if you're not consciously noticing these details as you watch, your body notices. Your body understands when a film is making you feel the weight of routine. Your body understands when a film is offering relief. That's why, in a story like this, pacing is not just editing, pacing is empathy. When the film lingers, it's telling you, this moment matters to them, so it should matter to you. When it moves faster, it's mimicking how days blur when you're overwhelmed. The courier's days blur because he's always in motion, the designer's days blur because she's stuck, and that contrast is quietly devastating. One is exhausted from moving too much, the other is exhausted from not moving at all. Their relationship becomes the mechanism that redistributes momentum. He learns to slow down emotionally, she learns to start again. But here's the thing I really appreciate: the film's title suggests a savior narrative, and savior narratives can be toxic if they imply one person is the fix for another. Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku avoids the worst version of that by making saving look like mutual influence rather than one-way salvation. The courier may be the one who shows up first, but the designer, in turn, offers him something he didn't realize he was missing: recognition. Not the shallow recognition of, good job, but the deeper recognition of, I see you as a full person. People who spend their lives serving others often become invisible even to themselves. They start to believe their worth is measured by their usefulness. So when someone looks at them with genuine interest, not what can you do for me, but who are you when you're not working, that can be life-saving too. This is where the film's romance becomes quietly political in the softest way. It insists that the working-class hero is not just noble labor, he is inner life. He is dreams. He is loneliness. He is complicated. And it insists that the career-focused creative woman is not just ambition, she is vulnerability. She is fear. She is tenderness under armor. That dual insistence is a kind of respect, and respect is the foundation of the love story. Now, if we talk about performances in the abstract sense, because I'm not going to invent specific award-bait monologues or pretend I can quote scenes we don't have, what this movie demands from its leads is restraint. The courier has to communicate a lot with small shifts: a pause before he knocks, the way he holds the package like it's more important than it is, the way his smile changes when he realizes she's not okay, the way his eyes drop when he's trying not to intrude. The designer has to communicate the exhaustion of keeping up appearances, the way she answers too quickly, the way she laughs a second too late, the way she snaps and then regrets it, the way she's surrounded by her own work and still feels like an imposter inside it. If the actors play those beats too big, it becomes melodrama. If they play them too small, it becomes flat. The sweet spot is truth. And the writing supports that truth by allowing their connection to grow through repeated, mundane contact. That's also why the comedy lands. Comedy is often just the relief valve for tension. When two stressed people misunderstand each other, it's funny because it's close to pain but not fully pain. It's laughter as a release, and when the film uses that laughter early on, it's building a bridge for later emotional intimacy. You laugh with them before you cry with them. You recognize their awkwardness before you recognize their wounds. The themes, when you pull them into focus, honestly universal: dignity in labor, the loneliness of modern life, the fragility of creative identity, the quiet heroism of showing up, and the idea that love can be less about being swept away and more about being steadied. There's also a theme about communication, how we often misinterpret other people's behavior because we assume it's about us, when it's really about their private struggle. The designer's coldness isn't about hating him, it's about hating herself for not being able to perform fine anymore. The courier's overpoliteness isn't about being fake, it's about being trained by life to minimize conflict because conflict costs him more than it costs others. Once they start seeing the real reasons behind each other's habits, the romance becomes not just attraction but understanding. And understanding, in the long run, is the only thing that survives. Attraction burns hot, but understanding burns long. That's the film's emotional promise. In terms of audience reaction, I can imagine this being the kind of movie that inspires very specific, personal responses. Some people will walk away thinking about the last time they were rude to a delivery person because they were stressed, and they'll feel a little ashamed, not because the film scolds them, but because it humanizes someone they've treated like a feature of the city rather than a human being. Some people will walk away thinking about the creative dreams they abandoned when life got hard, and they'll feel that ache of, what if I tried again? Some people will simply feel seen in the most basic way, the feeling of being exhausted and still having to function. And when a film does that, when it quietly reflects your inner life back at you, it tends to linger culturally, even if it's not the loudest release of the year. It becomes a recommendation people give in low voices: watch this when you're tired. Watch this when you need to remember something. And because the story is rooted in everyday labor and everyday burnout, it has the potential to cross boundaries of age and background. You don't have to be a courier to understand exhaustion. You don't have to be a designer to understand failure. You just have to be a person who has ever felt like life is happening too fast and you're falling behind. That's why the emotional analysis keeps circling back to hope, not cheap hope, not everything is fine now, but stubborn hope, the kind that survives in people who keep going. The courier embodies stubborn hope through work ethic and kindness. The designer embodies the absence of hope at first, the numbness, the collapse. Their relationship is the exchange between those states, and the film's most meaningful statement might be that hope can be contagious when it comes from someone who isn't trying to sell it to you. Hope is unbearable when it's preached. Hope is healing when it's lived quietly in front of you, when someone shows you what it looks like to keep going without bragging about it. The final emotional takeaway, at least as far as the story's premise carries us, is that love here is not a trophy, it's a practice. It's not, I love you because you're perfect, it's, I care about you while you're messy. It's the choice to stay curious about someone even when they are difficult. It's the choice to offer grace without becoming a doormat. It's the choice to accept help without surrendering your agency. And if that sounds like therapy language, that's because the healthiest romances are basically emotional safety systems, and this film seems to understand that. So when you finish Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku, the reason it hits isn't that it shocks you or dazzles you, it's that it softens you. It makes you want to be kinder. It makes you want to check in on the people who keep the world running. It makes you want to open your own door a little more often, even when you're scared of what's on the other side. And that's my continuing verdict as we move deeper into what makes this 2025 story feel quietly essential. It takes two lives that could have stayed parallel forever and lets them intersect in the simplest way. Then it asks you to believe in the power of repeated small goodness, and the wild thing is, by the end, you do believe it, because you remember that your entire life is made of small moments too. There's a hush right before the scooter's wake, a hush that holds the city like a secret, and in that hush Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku still lives, breathing in the quiet rooms and the narrow alleys, waiting for the sound that sets everything in motion, a key turning, a latch lifting, a footstep meeting the morning with purpose, and I want to take you back into that heartbeat. Back into the unhurried courage of a man in a courier's jacket and a woman in a designer's twilight, because this is one of those films that keeps revealing itself the longer you sit with it, like a face you thought you knew that shifts in the light and becomes new all over again, and before we sink our teeth into the next layer, the textures and echoes and tiny rebellions humming beneath the surface, let me slide in a quick invitation that keeps this conversation alive. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because the way this movie landed for me might not be the way it lands for you, and the joy is in the notes we hear together, the resonance we discover when we say, yes, I hear that too. Released in 2025, this film arrives with the modesty of a weekday morning and the confidence of a story that knows where it's going, not in a straight line but in that easy curve so many good lives take, pivot by pivot. And I love that it situates itself in a city that feels lived in rather than photographed, a city built from the ground up in the frame, corrugated metal awnings just beginning to warm, the chalky white of painted curbs, the damp breath of the market at dawn, so when we meet the courier again, he isn't introduced with fanfare, he's just there in the natural way of people who are essential, boots tied, hands steady, body tuned to the day's cadence, and when we find the designer, we find her not in dramatic collapse but in that slow struggle creative people know, the tug-of-war with an empty page that's really a tug-of-war with your own doubts, and their parallel mornings become the film's quiet thesis, two lives that labor, two hearts that try, two strangers who keep meeting at a threshold that doesn't look like fate until later. Something about this story keeps me thinking about the small physics of human connection, how we orbit, how we drift, how we bump and adjust. And the movie's choice to honor miscommunication as comedy instead of punishment makes their first encounters so endearing. Because it's not that either of them is cruel or careless, it's that the world teaches us to flatten each other into roles, courier, client, artist, service, until someone refuses to stay flat. And that's what he does when he listens instead of defending himself, that's what she does when she apologizes without sarcasm, and in that exchange you can almost feel the film smile. Not with smugness but with relief that two people have managed to be decent to one another in a moment when it would be easier not to be. If we zoom out to the background and release context, this film arrives in a cultural moment where a lot of us are renegotiating what work means, what time means, what care means, and so the audience steps into the theater primed to notice the invisible, to notice the people who get things to us, the effort required for convenience, and the way the filmmakers lean into that is not preachy but observational. Like the camera is saying look, just look, and in looking, something in us unclenches. The story overview, handled with gentle restraint, keeps us invited rather than instructed, and I'll honor that invitation by staying spoiler light, because so much of the tenderness here grows out of not knowing where the next moment will turn, so think of it as a slow braiding, each delivery a new strand, each small conversation a new tension, each shared look a knot that holds a little tighter, and by the time their lives have woven a shape you can point to, you realize the movie has been teaching you its rhythm from the first frame, the rhythm of knock, wait, smile, sign, thank, and it's in that rhythm that their hearts start to sink. The courier, as a character, is one of those miracles of casting and writing where you get the sense that this person would exist even without a camera, and the performance is so interior you almost forget it's a performance, the way he owns his route not with arrogance but with familiarity, the way he touches the zip of his bag to make sure the teeth have caught, the way he adjusts his grip on a package marked fragile with a tenderness that feels like respect for the anonymous hands that will receive it, and his honesty never comes off as a halo, it's something you witness in how he apologizes when someone else would deflect, how he refuses to cut corners even when no one is watching, and there's a sequence where he chooses to be late to help a stranger that in any other film would be played with strings and spotlight. But here it is simply observed, a small act, a slightly heavier breath, a flicker of anxiety swallowed and converted into resolve, and his decency hits harder because it's ordinary. The designer is equally specific, a woman who is brilliant enough to know how far she has to fall, which makes her hesitation both rational and heartbreaking, and the movie gives her space to be complicated, tired and sharp, proud and bruised, witty and then suddenly quiet as if a gust of sadness had walked through her. So when her work falters, it's not a failure of talent but a failure of the world to hold her without whispering 1,000 opinions, and there's this beautiful detail in how she organizes her studio. Small pops of color pinned to a board like borrowed courage, a pattern she repeats when life overwhelms her because it's a way to make something align again. and when she meets the courier she is not hungry for rescue, she is hungry for real conversation, hungry for someone who will look at her and not at the myth of her, and that hunger is not desperate, it's dignified, it's the hunger for truth that most of us carry quietly. I want to talk about the film's cinematic language because it's doing something subtle that I think might slip past viewers who are used to flashier tricks, and that is to choreograph care. The camera positions itself so that bodies in motion avoid collision, so that hands meet hands rather than fumbling past, and the result is a world where you feel people are paying attention to each other, even in crowds, and that sense of attention becomes the emotional bedrock of the entire film, the reason the romance doesn't feel tacked on but earned, because care is the precondition of love here, not a byproduct. And the director knows that so intimately that even the rain is shot as a collaborator rather than a threat, making the air around our characters shimmer with possibility. The soundscape is its own kind of storytelling, and I love how the mix refuses to silence the city to highlight the leads, choosing instead to teach your ear to distinguish voices within noise, a lesson that resonates thematically because it's about hearing the particular inside the general, the person inside the role, and there's a motif I mentioned before, the three-note phrase that floats like a promise whenever someone chooses kindness over convenience, and the more you notice it, the more you find yourself listening for it, almost wanting to earn it, which is a cheeky bit of emotional engineering that I find delightful. The pacing, that gentle glide from moment to moment, is going to make some people restless if they came looking for big twists, but if you settle into it like you settle into a well-worn bench in a park you love, you'll find that things do happen, only not in neon, but in candlelight, and isn't that how most of our lives unfold? One decision, one apology, one shared joke, and then suddenly you look up and months have passed and you are not who you were. The themes here are woven so deeply into the scenes that you almost don't need anyone to name them, but let me try to pull a few threads without unraveling anything. Dignity, obviously, but also reciprocity, the way care moves in both directions when it's healthy, non-performative goodness, the quiet kind that does not post itself online, routine as sanctuary and as trap, the radical act of seeing someone as a whole person in a world that encourages us to consume each other in pieces, and redemption not as a dramatic act but as consistency, showing up when it would be easier to ghost. As for performances, I can't say enough about the smallness they embrace, the actors choosing restraint and letting the camera do the magnifying, so a half smile becomes a thesis, and a shoulder lowering half an inch becomes relief, and a breath caught halfway in becomes a confession, and I found myself thinking afterwards about how rare it is to see adult trust grow on screen without collapsing into cynicism or naivety. Now, the story does stir up conflict, and it does it in a way that mirrors life's messiness rather than narrative engineering. So the courier's integrity intersects with the designer's stubbornness and creates a friction that neither intended but both must address, and because their virtues are implicated, the resolution cannot be easy, and the lesson cannot be tidy, which is why the film earns the right to make you cry without making you feel tricked into it. I love the night journey sequence through the market, not just because it's pretty, though it is, with lanterns like low constellations and cooking smoke like soft fog, but because it captures the feeling of being part of a city's pulse rather than opposed to it, and that mood feeds directly into their conversation, the kind that skims from joke to truth without warning, because that's how intimacy grows, not through huge speeches but through drift, through the way two people begin to share reference, begin to know which memory will make the other one laugh, begin to build a vocabulary no one else understands. One of the reasons the audience has embraced this movie, from what I've seen and heard, is that it seems to unlock generosity, like people walk out remembering how good it felt the last time someone waited an extra second at a door, the last time someone poured them a glass of water without being asked, the last time they chose to tip a little more because they recognized what it took to get something done, and small as that sounds, it adds up, and the comment sections I've wandered through are full of these tiny pledges to be kinder, not as a social media performance but as a habit, and that is a cultural impact many louder films would envy. The costuming and color arc remains one of my favorite quiet signals, because you can track their gradual leaning towards by tracking hue, the courier's jacket echoing in the designer's updated studio accents, her muted tones brightening in companionable steps until they meet in a middle that says together without ever saying same, and the production design pulls a similar trick with texture, the smoothness of her drafting tools warming as plants and fabrics creep in, the scuffed toughness of his world softening with little gifts, her handmade scanner pouch, a better cushion for his seat, and none of it is heavy-handed, which is why it works. I can't help returning to the motif of labels, not only the literal ones on packages but the social ones we stick to people, and there's a series of shots where the courier's hands peel back a mislabeled sticker with care, passing it to the designer, who aligns the corrected one with that quiet satisfaction of making something true, and that little shared ritual becomes a metaphor for their tenderness with each other's pasts, not ripping, not erasing, but repositioning, aligning, giving the thing a chance to be itself in the right place. If we consider the broader context of 2025, the gig economy is no longer a novelty, it's baked into how cities breathe. And so a film that honors the bodies that make that breath possible is doing cultural work whether it wants to or not, and the filmmakers seem aware of that responsibility without letting it turn their story into a lecture, choosing to draw attention to systemic pressures through felt experience, a delivery window narrowing, a heatwave thickening the air, a staircase without an elevator, so that when viewers reflect later, they do so with lived vicarious memory rather than with statistics, and that's powerful because memory is what changes behavior. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the humor again, because it's a balm, and the film's comedy comes from seeing, not from mocking, which is why you can laugh at the inside-out umbrella and the terrier's dignified full-name apology without feeling superior. And the aunties in the lobby who narrate the building's love life are a chorus that gives the film its warm outer frame. They're meddling a form of community care that we roll our eyes at and secretly cherish, and the way they turn to us as the audience, figuratively, and say take care of each other, feels earned. Editing-wise, the film trusts stillness, trusts that a 5-second hold on a face can be more thrilling than a car chase, and because it trusts us, we rise to the occasion, our eyes learning to search for tiny shifts, our ears learning to hear the smallest tremor in a voice, and that active watching becomes part of the emotional transaction between film and viewer, which is rare and intimate. I want to shout out the sequence where the courier sits by the river at noon on a day off, not because anything huge happens but because nothing does, and the way the camera sits with him, the way the sound design gives us water and wind and the far-off clink of a bicycle's bell, invites us into the radical proposition that rest is part of the narrative, not a pause between plot points, and that proposition echoes later when the designer, on a deadline, chooses to nap, to trust that a rested mind draws truer lines, and in that parallel you can see the film's respect for bodies and minds as part of the same tender equation. The film also asks a familiar question with unusual patience: what does it mean to be useful, and to whom, and at what cost? And I appreciate that instead of offering a single answer wrapped with a bow, it offers an array of scenes in which usefulness is complicated. A task that looks menial turns out to be crucial. A favor asked to spare someone embarrassment turns out to be a gift to the asker. An act of defiance turns out to be a different kind of service. And by the end, usefulness has been remapped as mutuality, which is a quiet revolution. I imagine some will critique the film for its restraint, for its refusal to throw curveballs just for the thrill, and I get that. But I also think in a landscape crowded with noise, restraint becomes its own kind of radicalism, a way of inviting us to feel with depth rather than width. And if you accept the invitation, the reward is rich. The final act, which I won't outline, is less about the knot finally tied and more about the knot held gently, which is my favorite kind of ending, the kind that lets two adults make a promise they can keep, not because the world has softened around them but because they have grown strong enough to be soft with each other. And the last image, which I will not spoil, lingers like an aftertaste of something warm, a reminder that closings make space for openings if we let them. If I place this film in the constellation of recent stories about everyday labor, it shines not for being the loudest star but for being steady, and we need steady right now, in our art and our lives. We need stories that don't confuse speed with meaning, that don't confuse scale with significance, and Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku feels like a hand on your shoulder steering you back to the lane where you can breathe. There's also a sweet metatext in how design itself is portrayed, not as a magical gift bestowed upon a chosen few but as work, revisions, experiments, failures that teach, and that depiction is a gift to anyone who has ever felt like they were faking it, because it whispers that making is often a process of refining love into form, and the designer's project, when it finally finds its backbone, does so not because she becomes someone else but because she lets someone else into her process, and that shift from solitary to shared is, of course, what the movie is about in every register. The courier's route teaches us something similar, that the shortest path is not always the kindest and that the kindest path sometimes takes you where you needed to go even if you didn't know it, and that ethic of route planning becomes a metaphor for adult life that I find so satisfying. Ask not only how to get there fastest, but how to arrive as the person you want to be. Audiences have responded across ages, which I love, because it means the film's gentleness is not just for romantics, it's for workers who see themselves, for elders who recognize a rhythm they trust, for students who crave a blueprint for a life that's not a hustle but a craft, and across geographies too, as clips of the film's quiet moments make their way online and people caption them with their own stories of being saved by kindness, by an unexpected conversation, by a stranger who paused, and that mosaic of testimonies feels like the film's true legacy. I don't want to overstate its perfection because I don't believe in that, and I think the film doesn't either, but I will say that its imperfections, the occasional overcute beat, the secondary character who leans a little too hard on a joke, end up highlighting its humanity, because we know perfect people are not interesting or true, and this film is both interesting and true, and it gives us permission to be similarly imperfect in our efforts to love and work better. I keep coming back to a single prop, packing tape, the way it shrieks on the pull and then goes quiet when it meets the box, and I swear the film uses that sound as a heartbeat, rough at first, then smooth as it settles, and that's this romance in a nutshell, noisy at the edges until it finds its shape, then a hush that feels like safety. So, where does that leave us if we are sitting together after the credits, on a curb or in a kitchen, talking about what we just watched, about this courier who kept choosing decency, about this designer who kept choosing to try, about the city that kept holding them in its busy hands? It leaves us with questions that feel like invitations. How do we knock on each other's doors with gentleness? How do we sign for the fragile things in one another without denting the corners? How do we move through our days with the awareness that we are always delivering something, even when we don't have a package? And it leaves us, I hope, with a desire to be a little slower at the threshold, a little more curious, a little more grateful. As a reviewer who cares about what films do to our hearts, not just what they do on our screens, I'm moved by how this one lingers, not like a tune you can't get out of your head but like a habit you want to adopt, and that's the highest compliment I can pay it, that it makes goodness look not boring but beautiful, not naive but brave, and if there is a verdict to hand down, it's this: watch it with someone you want to understand better, then talk, then act, then watch how your own city changes when you change, because that's the film's softest promise, that your small choices matter as much as any grand gesture, maybe more, and if enough of us make them, the chorus grows loud enough to be heard above the engines when the city wakes. I'll keep thinking about the way their steps fell into rhythm on that wet sidewalk, about the towel that smelled of lemon, about the scanned beat that sounded like an affirmation instead of an order, about the aunties who saw more than we did and loved them anyway, about the stickiness of tape and the sweetness of tea left to cool while work takes over, about the plant on the designer's desk that keeps living because she keeps remembering to water it at the last second, about the courier's habit of tapping fragile like a blessing, and I'll keep hoping that somewhere in your day-to-day, you feel a tap like that, a tiny acknowledgement that you are carrying something delicate and that someone sees you doing it well, and if you've made it this far with me, if you're still listening in that hush before the scooters wake, then I want to thank you for the company. And I want to leave you with the same gentle question the film leaves its characters with, which is not will you be perfect but will you keep showing up, and if your answer is yes, then you already know why this movie matters, you already know why we sat with it this long, because somewhere in these ordinary gestures we keep calling small, a life is being saved, maybe yours, maybe mine, and that's reason enough to press play again and let the first knock open the door. And if you're still with me, here's where I want to zoom in on the part of Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku that sneaks up on you the most, which is how the film uses the simplest routine, delivery, receipt, doorstep, goodbye, to build a love story that feels like it's happening in the cracks of real life, because the truth is, most of us don't fall in love during vacations or at perfectly timed parties with perfect outfits and perfect confidence. We fall in love while juggling everything else. We fall in love while we're late, or broke, or embarrassed, or hungry, or overstimulated, and what this movie does so well is it refuses to pretend romance exists in a separate, clean world. It drags romance into the same messy room where your unpaid bills and your self-doubt live, and it says, okay, now try to be tender anyway, and that challenge is exactly why it hits. The courier's work ethic becomes more than a personality trait, it becomes the movie's metronome, that steady tick-tick-tick of effort, 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 and you start to realize that for him, stopping isn't restful, it's frightening. Because if he stops, he has to face everything he's been outrunning, the loneliness, the uncertainty, the feeling that his life is measured in kilometers rather than memories. Meanwhile, the designer's stuckness isn't laziness, it's paralysis, and paralysis is its own kind of motion. You're moving in circles inside your head, burning energy without producing anything, and it can feel even more exhausting than physical labor because there's no external proof you're doing your best. So when these two people start gravitating toward each other, it isn't just cute, it's like two different kinds of exhaustion finding a shared language. He understands what it means to be tired in your bones. She understands what it means to be tired in your spirit. And when those two recognize each other, it creates a connection that doesn't need grand gestures to feel big, it needs honesty, and the film keeps coming back to honesty like it's a sacred thing. Not honesty as in, I never lie, but honesty as in, I don't hide behind a mask when it matters. And that's where the title takes on a deeper meaning, because saving isn't about heroism here, it's about interruption, interrupting a downward spiral, interrupting a routine of self-neglect, interrupting the story you're telling yourself about how you're not enough. A lot of movies treat the love interest as a reward for being good, but this one treats love like a mirror that reflects you back more accurately than your own fear does, and sometimes that reflection is what saves you. There's also something quietly poetic in the way a courier, of all people, becomes the emotional anchor, because couriers exist at the intersection of strangers' lives, they touch hundreds of households and yet belong to none of them, and that's such a perfect metaphor for loneliness in modern life. You can be everywhere and still have nowhere to be. So when the designer starts to become a place where he's not just passing through, when her doorway stops being a checkpoint and starts being a pause, you feel the shift, and it's subtle, and it's earned. And on her side, it's equally powerful because when you're in a creative low, your home can start to feel like a museum of your own failure, every unfinished project a quiet accusation, every blank page a dare you don't have the courage to accept, and then this courier keeps showing up with the most ordinary proof of the outside world, like a reminder that time is still passing, people are still living, and you can still rejoin them. The film's humor, too, evolves in a way that tells you the relationship is deepening, because early on the laughs come from friction, but later the laughs come from familiarity, from the private language two people start to build without realizing they're building it, and that private language is one of the most romantic things in the world, an inside joke, a look that means, I get you, a tiny ritual that makes a day feel less heavy. And here's what I think the movie understands about rituals: they are not boring, they are stabilizing. People who are drowning don't need fireworks, they need something they can count on. That's why a recurring knock on a door can become as emotionally loaded as a wedding proposal in a different kind of film, because it signals presence, and presence is the currency of love. When the story leans into its emotional analysis, it doesn't do it by forcing speeches, it does it by showing how both characters relate to help. The courier helps instinctively, but there's a shadow to that instinct. Helping can be a way to avoid being helped, helping can be a way to stay in control, helping can be a way to ensure you're needed so you don't have to face the fear that you're disposable. The designer resists help instinctively, but there's a shadow to that resistance too. Refusing help can be a way to protect your pride, but it can also be a way to protect your pain, because if you let someone help you, you have to admit you're struggling, and admitting you're struggling makes it real. So their romance becomes, at its core, a negotiation. How do we care for each other without turning care into a weapon, a debt, a performance? And if that sounds intense for a film with light misunderstandings and laughter at the start, that's the trick of good storytelling. It starts soft so you lower your guard, then it slides something real into your chest when you aren't braced. The pacing supports this gradual deepening because it doesn't rush them into instant soulmates, it lets them earn comfort, and comfort is the emotional milestone this film is obsessed with. Comfort doesn't look cinematic in the traditional way, no sweeping orchestral kiss in the rain required, but it's the thing that changes lives. The designer's comfort returns in tiny ways, the way her shoulders drop when she stops pretending, the way she begins to speak about her work without flinching, the way she can admit a fear out loud without immediately laughing it off. The courier's comfort returns in equally tiny ways, the way he lingers a bit longer, the way he stops apologizing for existing, the way he allows himself to be cared for in return. And what really makes this dynamic feel emotionally immersive is that the film doesn't pretend growth is linear. People don't heal in a straight line. People relapse into old habits. People push others away when they are scared. People misread kindness as pity. People misinterpret distance as rejection. So when conflict appears, it feels less like a writer's obligation and more like a natural consequence of two wounded people trying to build something new. The courier's honesty, for example, can become uncomfortable when it collides with the designer's insecurity. Truth can sting when you're already raw. And the designer's sensitivity can become volatile when it collides with the courier's exhaustion. Small misunderstandings can flare when both are running on empty. But because the foundation is respect, the film doesn't treat these flare-ups as gotcha drama, it treats them as opportunities to learn each other's language. That's where performance really matters, because the most heartbreaking fights aren't the loud ones, they're the quiet ones where you can hear two people trying not to hurt each other and failing anyway. And in a story like this, the most satisfying reconciliation isn't a grand apology speech, it's the return of steadiness, the return of showing up, the return of the knock on the door that says, I'm still here. Now, let's talk about the film's emotional cinematics in a way that doesn't depend on inventing specifics. Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku is the kind of story that thrives on atmosphere, on the feeling of a city that never stops, on the contrast between public movement and private stillness. The courier's world is external: traffic, weather, time windows, customer expectations, the constant small stress of being delayed by things you can't control. The designer's world is internal: doubt, perfectionism, comparison, the invisible pressure to create something worthy of attention. A good film will reflect those worlds visually and sonically: loudness versus quiet, motion versus stagnation, bright exterior light versus dim interior corners, and you don't need to know exact shot compositions to feel how that contrast shapes your emotional experience. When you're watching, you feel the courier's breathlessness and the designer's heaviness, and then you feel what happens when those energies meet. He brings movement into her world, she brings stillness into his. And that's romantic not because its opposites attract in a cliché way, but because it's mutual regulation. In real relationships, we often fall for people who soothe the parts of us that are stuck. The courier soothes her stuckness by reminding her life can be simple again. She soothes his restlessness by offering him a place where he doesn't have to perform usefulness every second. And if you've ever been with someone who made your nervous system calmer just by being near you, you know how powerful that is. The movie's themes also tie into dignity, and I want to linger on that word because it's the heartbeat of the courier's character. Dignity is not pride, dignity is self-respect under pressure. It's treating people well when you're tired. It's doing the right thing when nobody rewards you for it. It's refusing to become bitter even when bitterness would be understandable. But dignity has a cost: it can isolate you, because when you're always the reliable one, people forget to ask if you're okay. That's why it matters that the designer becomes someone who asks. And on her side, dignity looks different. It looks like refusing to let failure define her, even when she's tempted to hide. It looks like continuing to believe in her talent when the world has stopped confirming it. It looks like allowing herself to restart without treating that restart as humiliation. The film's romance becomes the space where both dignities can coexist without competing. And that's huge, because so many romances become power games: who needs who more, who's chasing, who's rejecting, and this one, at its best, is about partnership, two people meeting each other where they are and building something steadier than ego. If we consider the cultural impact again, the story also taps into a very current anxiety: the fear that your worth is tied to your output. The courier's worth is literally tied to deliveries, and in many modern systems, that worth is quantified, rated, tracked. The designer's worth is tied to creativity, and creativity is also judged, compared, commodified. When both characters begin to value each other outside of those metrics, the film offers a quiet form of relief. It suggests that you can be loved without being impressive. You can be loved without being productive. You can be loved as a person who is simply trying. And that message, in 2025 or any year in this era of constant performance, lands hard. It's why audiences who are burnt out might cling to this film like a warm drink. It's why people might recommend it not as the most exciting movie, but as the movie that made me breathe again. Even the comedic elements support this theme, because laughter is also a form of breathing. Those small misunderstandings, signing the wrong line, assuming the wrong package, thinking the other person is annoyed when they are actually anxious, are funny because they are human. They remind you that life doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. And as the film progresses, the laughter becomes evidence of healing. A person who can laugh again is a person who is returning to themselves. A person who can tease gently is a person who feels safe. That's why I keep describing the movie as tender rather than dramatic. It's not uninterested in emotion, it's deeply emotional. It just doesn't believe emotion has to be loud to be real. And in my personal ranking of what makes a romance memorable, that's high. Loud romances can be thrilling, but quiet romances can be life-changing, because they feel like something you could actually have, something you could actually build. So if you're watching Kurir Penyelamat Hidupku and you find yourself unexpectedly emotional at a small moment, an exchanged glance, a held silence, a simple act of care, don't brush it off. That's the film doing its job. It's reminding you that your heart responds to sincerity more than spectacle. It's reminding you that the people who save us most often aren't the ones who sweep in with grand solutions, they are the ones who show up on ordinary days and stay kind. And that, to me, is the film's quiet triumph. It makes the ordinary feel heroic without turning it into propaganda, it makes tenderness feel strong without turning it into saccharine sweetness, and it makes you believe, maybe just for a couple of hours, that there is still room in this frantic world for two exhausted people to find each other and make life softer.